Picture a man returning home. He's walking the path along the Seine that he's walked his entire life. The same river, the same sky, the same trees. But nothing else is the same. He fought at Alesia. He watched friends die. He watched Vercingetorix surrender. And now he's come home to find Roman soldiers camped on the riverbank. Roman engineers surveying the land where he used to hunt as a boy. Roman merchants setting up stalls in what used to be the gathering places of his people. He speaks to his neighbors in Gaulish, the language of his grandfather, the language his children speak. But the Roman tax collector doesn't understand Gaulish. The Roman magistrate doesn't care about Gaulish law. The druids who used to settle disputes are gone, fled or killed or in hiding. This man is Parisii. His father was Parisii. But what will his children be? Welcome back to the Chicano in Paris podcast. I'm Rudy Martinez, and this is our deep dive into the history of Paris. Last episode, we met the Parisii, the Celtic people who lived along the Seine, who built their lives along this river, who joined Vercingetorix in the desperate fight for Gallic freedom. We watched them go to war, and we watched them lose. Today, we're going to sit with what came after. Because conquest isn't just a battle. It's generations of people trying to navigate an impossible reality. It's languages disappearing, gods being forgotten, identities transforming in ways that can't be stopped or reversed. This is the story of what happened to the Parisii, and it's the story of how a Roman city called Lutetia rose from the ashes of their world. Part 1. The year is 51 BCE. The Gallic revolt has been crushed. Vercingetorix is in chains on his way to Rome, where he'll be paraded through the streets in Caesar's triumph, and then executed. The relief army that tried to save him at Alesia was scattered. Tens of thousands of Gallic warriors are dead. And the survivors are coming home. Think about what that homecoming must have been like. You're a Parisii warrior. Maybe you're in your 20s. Maybe you're in your 40s. You left your village months ago with your neighbors, your cousins, and maybe your sons. You believed in Vercingetorix. You believed the tribes could unite, could drive out the Romans, could preserve the old ways. And you lost. Maybe you were at Alesia, trapped inside those walls, watching your rations dwindle, watching men die of hunger. Maybe you were in the relief force, attacking the Roman fortifications, again and again, until finally, impossibly, the attack failed and the army broke and ran. Now you're walking home, and you don't know what you're going to find. Did the Romans burn your village? Is your family alive? Your farm, is it still yours, or has it been given to some Roman veteran as a reward for service? We don't have personal accounts from the Parisii survivors. They left no diaries, no letters. But we know what happened across Gaul after the revolt. Caesar had been lenient with tribes that surrendered quickly. He needed allies, needed people to grow food and pay taxes. But the tribes that resisted, that joined Vercingetorix, they paid a price. The price varied. Some communities saw their land confiscated and redistributed. Some were required to provide hostages, noble children sent to Rome, supposedly as guests, but really as leverage to ensure their people's good behavior. Some faced collective punishment, executions of leaders, enslavement of captives, crushing tribute payments. The Parisii had resisted. They'd sent warriors to fight. Their leaders had made a choice, and now everyone lived with the consequences. Caesar himself gives us only the briefest account. He mentions that in 52 BCE, his general, Labienus, fought the Parisii. The Parisii commander was named Camulogenus, one of the few Parisii names we know. Caesar says Camulogenus was old, but still fierce, still willing to fight. He led the Parisii warriors in battle against Labienus on the plain near what's now Grenelle in the 15th arrondissement of modern Paris. The Parisii lost. Camulogenus died. The warriors were routed. And Caesar writes that the Parisii, before the Romans could capture their settlement, burned Lutetia themselves, destroyed their own bridges rather than let them fall into Roman hands. Whether this is actually what happened, or whether this is Roman propaganda to justify what came next, We don't know, but the message was clear. The Parisii had defied Rome. They would remember what that cost. In the immediate aftermath of conquest, there would have been Roman soldiers everywhere, not just passing through, stationed. Gaul wasn't secure. The tribes might rise again. The Germans across the Rhine were always a threat. So Rome established a military presence. For the Parisii, this meant living with occupation. Soldiers in their villages, soldiers on the roads, soldiers taking supplies, food, timber, whatever the army needed, and sometimes paying, sometimes not. Soldiers who didn't speak Gaulish, who had no interest in local customs, who represented everything that had been lost. The old political structure was gone. The Parisii chiefs, the men who had led them, who had made decisions for the tribe, were either dead, discredited, or had submitted to Rome. New men rose to power, men who were willing to collaborate, to work within the Roman system, men who saw that resistance was suicide and accommodation was survival. These men had an impossible job. They had to keep their people alive while serving an occupying power. They had to maintain some shred of Parisii identity while accepting Roman authority. They had to explain to their children why things would never be the way they were before. And then there were the druids. Remember the druids from the last episode? The priests, the judges, the teachers, the keepers of tradition and memory. 20 years of training, all oral, preserving the knowledge of generations. The Romans hated the druids, not just for religious reasons, though the Romans found druidic practices barbaric, but for political reasons. The druids were the intellectual elite of Gallic society. They maintained networks across tribal boundaries. They could unite people in ways that threatened Roman control. Emperor Claudius, a few decades after the conquest, would formally ban Druidism throughout Gaul. But the persecution started earlier. Druids went into hiding. They stopped teaching publicly. The sacred groves where they had performed rituals for centuries were cut down or turned into Roman temples. Think about what this means. The Druids were the living library of Parisii culture. They held the poetry, the law, the history, the religious knowledge. And when the Druids disappeared, that knowledge disappeared with them. Generations of accumulated wisdom lost. Some Druids probably tried to preserve what they could, taught in secret, passed knowledge to students in whispers, but it couldn't last. The old ways required a society that supported them, and that society was being dismantled piece by piece. Part 2. The Romans didn't just occupy Parisii territory, they transformed it. Starting in the decades after Caesar's conquest, probably accelerating under Emperor Augustus in the early 1st century CE, the Romans began building a city. Not a Gallic settlement with organic winding paths and timber buildings clustered near the river. A Roman city, orderly, permanent, monumental. They called it Lutetia. The name probably comes from the Latin word for mud or swamp, lutum, not exactly poetic. But practical Romans cared less about romantic names and more about strategic value. Lutetia controlled a crossing point on the Seine. It connected the road networks running north to south through Gaul. It was worth developing. The Romans chose to build their city on the left bank of the Seine, on the slopes of what's now called Montagne Sainte-Geneviève. This was smart urban planning. The hillside was above the floodplain, drier and more defensible than the lower-lying island or right bank. It offered views over the river valley. It had space to expand. The old Parisii settlement had been on the Ile de la Cité, the island in the river. Some Parisii probably still lived there, and there were bridges connecting the islands to both banks. But the new Roman city center would be on the hill to the south. And the Romans built in a very particular way. If you could look down on Lutetia from above, in, say, the year 100 CE, you'd see a grid. Straight streets intersecting at right angles, creating rectangular city blocks. This was standard urban planning, replicated across the empire from Spain to Syria. The main north-south road was called the Cardo Maximus. It ran from the river crossing up the hill, roughly following what's now the Rue Saint-Jacques on the left bank, and continuing as the Rue Saint-Martin on the right bank. This was Lutetia's main artery, the road to Orléans in the south, the road to the channel ports in the north. Perpendicular to the Cardo was the Decumanus Maximus, the main east-west road, and from these two main axes, secondary streets branched off, creating that characteristic Roman grid. Walk those streets today, Rue Saint-Jacques, Boulevard Saint-Michel, Rue des Écoles, and you're following Roman roads. 2,000 years later, the bones of Lutetia still structure modern Paris. But streets were just the beginning. The Romans built in stone, limestone quarried from the hillside itself. You could still see the ancient quarries beneath the city, tunnels and chambers carved out over centuries. They used this stone to build monuments that proclaimed Roman power and Roman culture. The Forum, the heart of any Roman city, a large public square where people gathered for business, politics, and socializing. Colonnades where merchants set up shop. A basilica, not a church since Christianity hadn't arrived yet, but a large covered hall used for legal proceedings and public meetings. Temples, to Jupiter, king of the Roman gods, to Mercury, the god of commerce and travelers, to other Roman deities. These weren't hidden shrines and sacred groves. These were massive stone buildings raised on platforms with columns and pediments, visible from across the city. They dominated the skyline. That was the point. An amphitheater. This is one of those structures we can still see today. The Arène de Lutetia, discovered in the 19th century. It seated around 15,000 people. Imagine that, 15,000 people in a city that probably had a population of 5 to 10,000 at its height. People came from the surrounding countryside for entertainment. What did they watch? Gladiatorial combat, certainly. Wild animal hunts, theatrical performances, public executions. Entertainment that to us might seem barbaric. But to Romans, these spectacles were civic events. They reinforced social hierarchies, the best seats for the wealthy, the worst for the poor. They displayed Roman values, courage, martial prowess, justice. And for the Parisii watching these spectacles, what must they have thought? Their grandfathers had fought as warriors. Now they watched professionals fight and die for entertainment. Their ancestors had worshipped in secret groves. Now they sat in massive stone arenas, cheering as the crowds cheered, applauding on cue. Baths. The Romans loved their baths. Bathing wasn't just about getting clean. It was a social activity, a daily ritual. The baths at Lutetia, built in the early centuries CE, were substantial. You can still visit their ruins today, incorporated into the Musée du Cluny. The baths had all the standard Roman features. The frigidarium, the cold room with cold plunge pools. The tepidarium, the warm room. The caldarium, the hot room with hot baths. Under the floors ran the hypocaust system, hollow spaces where hot air from the furnaces circulated, heating the floors and walls. Romans would spend hours at the baths. They would exercise in the palaestra, the exercise yard. They'd scrape oil and sweat from their skin with curved metal tools called strigils. They'd gossip, conduct business, arrange marriages. The baths were where Roman social life happened. And the Parisii learned to use them, learned to adopt this Roman custom, learned to be Roman. An aqueduct. Rome couldn't function without massive amounts of water, not just for drinking, but for the baths, for fountains, for public toilets and industry. So Roman engineers built an aqueduct to bring water to Lutetia from springs to the south, near what's now Rungus. The aqueduct was a marvel of engineering. Mostly, it ran underground or at ground level, following the natural slope of the land. But in places, it had to cross valleys. And there the Romans built arcades, stone arches carrying the water channel. Sections of this aqueduct still exist, incorporated into buildings or visible in cellars across the left bank. The water flowed by gravity alone, dropping just meters over kilometers, arriving at Lutetia to fill reservoirs and then distribute through the city via lead pipes. Clean running water available to everyone. This was Roman civilization. This was what conquest had brought. Part 3. So Lutetia was being built, stone temples and paved streets, baths and aqueducts. But who lived there? And what was daily life actually like? Here's what we need to understand. Lutetia wasn't a city of Romans. It was a city of Romanized Gauls. Yes, there were some actual Romans, soldiers, administrators, merchants from Italy. But the vast majority of the people living in Lutetia were locals, Parisii by ancestry, Gallo-Romans by culture. These were people living in two worlds at once. Let's imagine a family, 3 generations living together, which was common. The grandfather is in his 60s, born around 20 or 30 CE. He remembers when his father told him stories of the old days, before Rome, stories of the Great Revolt, of Vercingetorix, of a time when the Parisii were free. He still knows some of the old prayers to the Celtic gods, though he's careful about saying them aloud. He speaks Gaulish at home, though he's learned enough Latin to get by in the forum. His son, the father, is in his 30s, born after the conquest. He's never known anything but Roman rule. He's learned Latin properly in school, and yes, there were schools in Lutetia teaching Roman literature and rhetoric. He reads, he writes. He's adopted some Roman customs. He goes to the baths, he watches the games at the amphitheaters, but at home with his family, he still speaks Gaulish. He still feels Parisii in his heart, even if he's Roman in his daily life. And then there are the grandchildren. They're growing up in Lutetia. They speak Latin as naturally as Gaulish, maybe more so. The grandfather tries to teach them the old stories, but the stories don't mean what they used to. The gods he talks about, they're not as real as Jupiter and Mercury, whose temples dominate the city. The old ways are just that, old, quaint, something grandfather remembers, but not something that shapes their world. This is how culture dies. Not suddenly in a great catastrophe, gradually, across generations. Each generation is a little more Roman, a little less Parisii. Until one day, no one speaks Gaulish anymore. No one remembers the old stories. No one knows the prayers. We can track this transformation through archaeology. In the 1st century CE, we still find objects that are distinctly Celtic in style. Torques, brooches with Celtic designs, pottery with traditional patterns. By the 2nd century, those are rare. People are using Roman-style pottery, wearing Roman-style jewelry, furnishing their homes in Roman fashion. We can track it through names. Early inscriptions from Lutetia show Celtic names: Camulogenus, Atectorix, Ludovicus. Later inscriptions show Roman names: Marcus, Julius, Claudius. Sometimes we see hybrid names, a Roman first name with a Celtic family name, or vice versa, people navigating between identities. We can track it through language. Gaulish, the Celtic language the Parisii spoke, was still being spoken in the 1st and 2nd century CE, but it was declining. Latin was the language of power, commerce, education, and advancement. If you wanted to succeed in Lutetia, you learned Latin. You taught your children Latin. By the 3rd or 4th century CE, Gaulish was essentially extinct from Lutetia, replaced completely by Latin. And when a language dies, everything encoded in that language dies too. The nuances, the poetry, the way of seeing the world, gone. Religion transformed too. This was, in some ways, easier. The Romans were religiously tolerant, as long as you also honored the Roman gods and the emperor. So Gallic gods weren't banned outright. Instead, they were reinterpreted, syncretized to the Roman deities. The Gaelic god Tutatis, protector of the tribe, he became assimilated with Mars, Roman god of war. Tyrannus, the thunder god, he merged with Jupiter. Celtic goddesses associated with springs and rivers became Roman nymphs. This process is called interpretatio Romana, Roman interpretation, and it allowed continuity while fundamentally changing everything. A Parisii person could still honor their traditional gods, but now they did so in Roman temples, using Roman rituals, calling their gods by Roman names. Over time, the Celtic aspects faded. The temples and the sacred groves were abandoned. The ritual practices unique to Celtic religions were forgotten. What remained was a version of Roman religion with faint echoes of Celtic tradition. But here's something important. People adapted. They survived. They found ways to preserve what they could while accommodating what they couldn't change. Parisii craftsmen still made beautiful objects, but in Roman styles. Parisii farmers still worked the land, but paid taxes to Rome. Parisii mothers still raised their children, but taught them Latin and told them to respect the emperor. This wasn't collaboration exactly, and it wasn't resistance. It was survival. It was making the best of an impossible situation. It was loving your children enough to give them the tools to succeed in the world that existed, not the world that had been lost. And some things did survive. Archaeological evidence suggests that certain Celtic festivals continued, even if their meaning had changed. Certain craft traditions persisted. Certain names for places, rivers, hills, forests, retained their Celtic origins, even if they were Latinized. The Seine, the river at the heart of everything, kept a version of its Celtic name, Sequana. The goddess Sequana, associated with the river, continued to be honored even in the Roman period, though now with Roman-styled offerings and in a Roman-style temple. These fragments, these survivals mattered. They were threads of continuity in a world being remade. They were proof that the Parisii, even as they became Gallo-Romans, hadn't been entirely erased. But the truth is, most was lost. The druids' 20 years of memorized knowledge, lost. The oral poetry and history, lost. The religious practices and their meanings, lost. The language itself lost. The political autonomy, the tribal identity, the old way of life, all of it lost. What survived were echoes, shadows, place names and river names, and fragments of tradition so thoroughly transformed that they were barely recognizable. The Parisii gave Paris its name, but the people who gave that name were gone, absorbed into the Roman world. What remained were their descendants, living Roman lives, speaking a Latin language, worshiping Roman gods, but carrying somewhere deep within them the memory of who their ancestors had been. Part 4. By the 2nd century CE, Lutetia had settled into its place in the Roman world. It wasn't one of the great cities of the empire. It couldn't compare to Rome itself or Alexandria, or even Lyon, which was the capital of the larger province. Lutetia's population probably peaked at around 5,000 to 8,000 people, modest by imperial standards. But it was prosperous, and it was connected. The Seine made Lutetia a natural hub for trade. Boats moved up and down the river constantly, carrying goods north toward the Channel and the North Sea, south towards the heart of Gaul, and eventually the Mediterranean. The boatmen of Lutetia, the Nautae Parisiaci, were organized into a guild, a professional association that gave them collective power and status. We know about these boatmen because they left us something remarkable. In the early 1st century CE, during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, the Nautae dedicated a monument to Jupiter. It's called the Pilier des Nautes, the Pillar of the Boatmen. Fragments of it were discovered in 1711 beneath Notre Dame Cathedral and are now in the Musée de Cluny. The pillar is fascinating because it shows us that cultural mixing we talked about earlier. Some of the carved blocks show Roman gods, Jupiter, Vulcan, Mars, but others show Celtic gods, Isis, Smertrios, Cernunnos the horn god. Roman and Celtic deities side by side, honored together by the same people. This is what Gallo-Roman culture looked like. Not purely Roman, not purely Celtic, but something new, something hybrid. The Nautae were wealthy enough to dedicate a major monument. That tells us trade was lucrative. And what were they trading? Wine, certainly. Italian wine in amphorae, those distinctive clay vessels, flowed into Gaul in enormous quantities. The Gauls had developed a taste for wine under Roman influence, and imports were constant. Later, Gallic vineyards would begin producing their own wine, but in the early centuries, Mediterranean wine dominated. Olive oil, another Mediterranean staple that Romans couldn't live without. Grain, both imported and exported, depending on the harvest. Lumber from the forests that still covered much of northern Gaul. Metal goods, iron tools, bronze fixtures, lead pipes. Pottery, both fine tableware and everyday cooking vessels. Glass, manufactured locally by the 2nd century, as Gaulish glassmakers mastered techniques imported from the East. And luxury goods. This is important. Lutetia wasn't just a frontier town supplying basic necessities. Archaeological evidence shows that people in Lutetia had access to goods from across the empire and beyond. Fine pottery from southern Gaul known as terra sigillata, glossy red tableware that was the mark of refined dining, amber from the Baltic, spices from the east, silk that had traveled the Silk Road from China, passing through countless hands before arriving in Gaul. The wealthy residents of Lutetia, and there were wealthy residents, could furnish their homes with mosaics, painted frescoes, imported marble. They could wear jewelry crafted by skilled goldsmiths. The 4th century toga clasp found in Lutetia, now in a museum, is exquisite. Intricate metalwork showing the sophistication of local craftsmen. Lutetia was famous for its jewelers. If you were wealthy enough, you could commission a piece that rivaled anything made in Rome itself. The city was also connected by roads. Those famous Roman roads that still structure modern Paris were part of a vast network spanning the empire. From Lutetia, roads ran south to Orleans and eventually to the Mediterranean coast. North toward the Channel ports, Boulogne, and others that connected to Britain. East toward the Rhine, where Roman legions guarded against the Germanic tribes. West toward the Atlantic coast. Travelers passed through constantly. Merchants certainly, but also soldiers being transferred between postings, imperial officials on government business, couriers carrying messages, pilgrims visiting shrines. The roads had milestones marking distances, way stations where travelers could rest and change horses. The infrastructure of empire made travel safer and easier than it had been in centuries, than it would be again for centuries after Rome fell. And with travelers came news, ideas, fashions, religions. Lutetia wasn't isolated, it was a node in a network that stretched from Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain to the deserts of North Africa, from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. What was daily life for an ordinary resident of a 2nd century Lutetia? Let's imagine a day. You wake at dawn in your home. If you're moderately prosperous, you might have a small house with a few rooms, plastered walls painted with simple designs, tiled floors. If you're poorer, you might live in a timber building sharing space with multiple families. You dress in a tunic, woolen in winter, linen in summer. If you're going somewhere important, you might add a toga, though togas were formal wear, uncomfortable, and most people avoided them unless necessary. You head to the Forum for the morning. It's the center of city life. The colonnades are already busy with merchants setting up, and there's a shop selling pottery, another with metalwork, another with cloth. You stop at a bakery. Yes, there were bakeries producing bread for those who didn't bake at home. The smell of fresh bread mixes with the less pleasant odors. This is a city without modern sanitation, and you learn to ignore certain smells. You have business at the basilica. Perhaps you're involved in a legal dispute, a boundary disagreement with a neighbor, a debt that needs settling. The basilica is where justice is administered. Contracts are witnessed. Official business is conducted. It's crowded and noisy, people arguing their cases, scribes taking notes, magistrates trying to maintain order. Business concluded, you might stop at the baths. This is a social occasion as much as a hygienic one. You pay a small entrance fee. The baths are subsidized, kept affordable for the ordinary citizens. You exercise in the palaestra, perhaps playing a game of ball. Then through the sequence of rooms, hot, warm, cold, you scrape the oil and sweat from your skin. You chat with friends, discuss politics, hear the latest gossip. In the afternoon, if there's a show at the amphitheater, you might attend. Gladiatorial combat is a rare treat, expensive to stage, reserved for special occasions. More common are theatrical performances, acrobats, animal displays. You sit with the others of your social class. The seating is strictly organized. the wealthy in the best seats close to the action, the poor high up in the cheap seats. This is Rome. Everything reinforces the hierarchy. Evening comes. If you're wealthy, you might host a dinner party, a proper Roman cena with multiple courses, wine, entertainment. If you're ordinary, you eat a simple meal at home. Bread, cheese, vegetables, perhaps some meat if you can afford it. You might have some wine mixed with water. As night falls, the city quiets. There's no street lights beyond what the individual households provide. The streets are dark and potentially dangerous. Most people stay home. The night belongs to those who have no choice but to be out, or to those up to no good. This is life in Lutetia. Not so different in many ways from the life in hundreds of other Roman cities, the routine of empire, the stability of a system that, in the 2nd century, seemed like it would last forever. Because that's the thing about the 2nd century CE. It was the height of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. The empire had stopped expanding. The borders were stable, trade flourished, cities prospered. If you were a resident of Lutetia in, say, the year 150 CE, you had no reason to think this would ever end. Your grandparents had lived under Roman rule. Your parents had lived under Roman rule. You were living under Roman rule. And your children and grandchildren would live under Roman rule. This was simply the way the world was. The old Parisii? That was ancient history. Stories that grandfathers told, perhaps, but increasingly distant and irrelevant. The future was Roman. Latin was the language of the future. The emperor in Rome, whoever he might be, was the center of the world. Lutetia had found its place. It wasn't the most important city, but it was secure, prosperous, connected. It had everything a Roman city needed: monuments, infrastructure, commerce, culture. What could possibly go wrong? Part 5. The answer, of course, was everything. The 3rd century CE was catastrophic for the Roman Empire. Historians call it the crisis of the 3rd century, and it nearly destroyed Rome entirely. Between 235 and 284 CE, just 50 years, the empire had more than 20 emperors. Most died violently, killed by their own soldiers or rivals. The central authority collapsed. Generals declared themselves emperor and fought civil wars against each other while the frontiers crumbled. And beyond those frontiers, the Germanic tribes were moving. Pressured by migrations from the east, pushed by hunger and ambition, they saw a weakened empire and attacked. The Franks, the Alemanni, the Goths, wave after wave of raids deep into Roman territory. In 260 CE, the unthinkable happened. Emperor Valerian was captured in battle by the Persians. A Roman emperor, the supreme commander, the living embodiment of Roman power, taken prisoner. The humiliation was staggering. The western provinces, including Gaul, seceded from the empire. A Roman general named Postumus declared himself emperor of a breakaway Gallic empire. For 15 years, Gaul was effectively independent. When Emperor Aurelian reconquered it in 274, he withdrew troops from the Rhine frontier to fight his civil war, and the Germanic tribes poured through. They sacked city after city: Trier, Metz, Reims, and Lutetia. Lutetia had no walls. It had never needed them. For 2 centuries, the Pax Romana had protected it. The legions guarded distant frontiers. Peace reigned. Walls seemed unnecessary. Now that peace was shattered. Germanic warriors, Franks and Alemanni, swept through northern Gaul, looting and burning. When they reached Lutetia, there was nothing to stop them. We don't have detailed accounts of what happened, but we know the result. Parts of the left bank were abandoned: the amphitheater, the forum, the bathhouses. Structures that had stood for 2 centuries were suddenly liabilities. Their stones were more valuable as building material than as monuments. The people of Lutetia retreated to the Ile de la Cité. The island was defensible in a way that open hillside wasn't. Surrounded by water, it could be fortified with walls. And so they built. Hurriedly, desperately, They tore stone from the amphitheater, from abandoned buildings, from monuments that represented 2 centuries of Roman civilization, and they used those stones to build walls around the island, walls to keep out the chaos. The city shrank from 100 hectares at its height to perhaps 20 or 25 hectares, the island and a small section of the left bank. The population fell. Many fled to safer regions in the south, and others died in the raids or from famines and plagues that followed. Lutetia, which had been prosperous and growing, was now a fortified refuge clinging to survival. But it survived. And in a collapsing empire, survival was victory. The name began to change too. In official documents from the late 3rd and 4th centuries, Lutetia appears less frequently. Instead, we see Civitas Parisiorum, the city of the Parisii, and eventually, just Paris. The Parisii had been absorbed into the Roman world. Their language was gone. Their religion was gone. Their political identity was gone. But their name endured. And now, as the Roman world crumbled, that name reasserted itself. Lutetia was becoming Paris. Part 6. But even in this dark time, perhaps especially in this dark time, something new was growing. Something that would reshape not just Paris, but all of Europe. Christianity. Around the year 250 CE, according to tradition, a bishop named Denis arrived in Lutetia. He came from Rome, sent by Pope Fabian as part of a mission to evangelize Gaul. Denis brought with him 2 companions, a priest named Rusticus and a deacon named Eleutherius. They settled on the Ile de la Cité and began to preach. And they were successful. Too successful. The conversion of pagans to Christianity alarmed the Roman authorities and the pagan priests. Christianity was, at this time, illegal. Christians refused to worship the emperor as a god, refused to participate in pagan rituals, refused to acknowledge the traditional gods of Rome. This was seen as dangerous, subversive, and traitorous. Denis and his companions were arrested. They were imprisoned. According to legend, they were tortured, scourged, burned, thrown to wild beasts, and finally, they were led to the highest hill in Paris, the place that might have been a druidic holy site in the Celtic past, and was certainly a place sacred to the Roman gods. The Romans called it Mont Mercurius, the Hill of Mercury, or perhaps Montmartre, the Hill of Mars. There, Denis, Rusticus, and Eleutherius were beheaded. And here is where legend takes over from history. According to tradition, after Denis was beheaded, he picked up his severed head and walked several miles, preaching a sermon on repentance the entire way. He finally stopped at the place where his followers later built a shrine, the site that would become the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the burial place of French kings. The miracle of the cephalophore, the head-carrying saint. It's a powerful image, and Denis became the most famous example in Christian tradition. Whether or not the miracle happened, Denis' martyrdom had a profound effect. Martyrs were powerful in early Christianity. They were proof of faith so strong that death couldn't shake it. They inspired converts. They became intercessors, saints whose prayers could reach God. A Christian community formed around Denis' memory. His tomb became a pilgrimage site. And Christianity, despite persecution, continued to grow in Paris. By the early 4th century, things were changing across the empire. In 313 CE, Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity with the Edict of Milan. By the end of the century, Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire. Pagan temples were closed or converted to churches. Old gods were banned. In Paris, a small Christian church was built on the Ile de la Cité, near where Notre Dame would later stand. The first documented bishop of Paris was Victorinus, mentioned in 346 CE. In 360, the first council of bishops in Gaul convened in the city. Christianity wasn't just tolerated, it was becoming the dominant faith. The Gallo-Romans of Paris, who had once worshipped Jupiter and Mars, who had once honored the Celtic gods under Roman names, now filled churches. They were baptized, took communion, prayed to Christian saints. The transformation that had begun 3 centuries earlier from Parisii to Gallo-Roman was continuing. Now they were becoming Christian Gallo-Romans. Layer upon layer of identity, each wave of change obscuring what came before, but never quite erasing it. The Seine still flowed where it had always flowed. The stones in the walls of the island fortress were Roman stones, taken from Roman buildings, quarried by Roman techniques. The name Paris echoed the Celtic Parisii. The new churches stood on grounds that had been sacred for 1,000 years, first to the Celtic gods, then to the Roman gods, and now to the Christian God. Nothing was ever completely new. Nothing was ever completely destroyed. History layered upon history, each age building on the ruins of the one before. In 357 CE, something remarkable happened. Julian, Caesar of the Western Roman Empire, a title meaning he was second in command under the new emperor, made Paris his base. He'd been fighting Germanic invaders and needed a secure location. He chose Paris. Julian loved this city. In his writings, he describes it fondly: the mild climate, the island and the river, the good wine from the surrounding countryside. He spent winters there, governing, planning campaigns. In 360 CE, his troops proclaimed him emperor in Paris in opposition to the reigning emperor Constantius II. It was a rebellion technically, though Julian would eventually become the sole legitimate emperor. This moment mattered. For the first time in centuries, Paris was at the center of imperial events. Not the capital, Rome still held that title, at least nominally, but important, strategic, a city where emperors resided. It wouldn't last. Julian died in 363 fighting the Persians, and as the 4th century wore on, the empire continued to weaken. The western half especially was losing coherence. The Germanic peoples weren't just raiding anymore, they were settling permanently inside Roman territory. The Rhine frontier was increasingly a fiction. In Paris, people watched these developments with growing anxiety. Germanic tribes, Franks in particular, were moving into northern Gaul. Sometimes they came as raiders, sometimes as settlers, sometimes as federates, supposedly allies of Rome, but really independent powers. The 5th century brought more chaos. In 410, Rome itself was sacked by the Visigoths. Rome, the eternal city, the heart of the empire, conquered and looted. The psychological shock was enormous. In 451, Attila the Hun led his armies into Gaul. This was an existential threat. The Huns were the terror of the age, nomadic warriors from the eastern steppes, fierce and unstoppable. They'd been pushing Germanic tribes westward for decades. Now they were coming themselves. Paris faced destruction, and the people wanted to flee. But a young woman convinced them to stay. Her name was Geneviève. She was a nun, a deaconess, known for her piety and visions. Geneviève told the people of Paris that if they prayed, if they had faith, the city would be spared. It sounds like madness. Why would you stay when an army of Huns was approaching? But the people listened to her. They stayed. They prayed. And Attila turned away. He marched south toward Orleans instead. The combined forces of Romans and Visigoths defeated him at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. Paris was saved. Geneviève became the city's patron saint, Saint Geneviève. Her tomb would become a pilgrimage site. Churches would be built in her honor. She represented Paris in its darkest hour, standing firm when all seemed lost. But the empire was dying. In 476 CE, the last Western Roman emperor abdicated. The Western Roman Empire was over, just like that. 500 years of Roman rule in the West ended not with a dramatic battle, but with a whimper. The last emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed and sent into retirement. Germanic kings now ruled Italy, Spain, and Gaul. The map of Europe was being redrawn. And in the north, A Germanic people called the Franks were establishing dominance. They'd been moving into Gaul for decades, sometimes fighting Rome, sometimes serving as Roman allies, always growing stronger. By the late 5th century, they controlled much of northern Gaul. In 486 CE, a Frankish king named Clovis defeated the last Roman holdout in Gaul, a general named Syagrius, and then Clovis turned his attention to Paris. Picture the sun one more time, the same river flowing through the same valley, but now everything has changed. The monuments on the left bank are ruins. The stones of the amphitheater are part of a fortress wall. The aqueduct no longer flows. The forum is abandoned. The island is crowded with buildings, surrounded by walls. A Christian church stands where a pagan temple once stood. The language spoken in the streets is still Latin, but it's evolving, absorbing Germanic words, changing into something that will eventually become French. The people call themselves Romans still, out of habit, but the Roman Empire is gone. They live in a new world now, a world of Germanic kingdoms and Christian faith and uncertain frontiers. And a Frankish king is coming to their gates, a pagan warrior named Clovis, who commands armies and wins battles and is about to change everything once again. The Parisii are 3.5 centuries gone. Lutetia is becoming a memory. The Roman world has ended. But Paris is about to begin its next chapter. Because Clovis will make a choice that transforms not just Paris, but all of France. He'll convert to Christianity. He'll make Paris his capital, and from this island fortress, from this city that survived the Celts and Romans and Germanic invaders, a new kingdom will emerge. The Merovingian dynasty, the Frankish Empire, and eventually France itself. Next time, as we continue with the history of Paris, the Franks come to power. Clovis makes Paris a capital for the first time. Christianity and Germanic culture merge to create something new, and we'll meet the Merovingian kings who laid the foundation of medieval France. Thank you for listening.